Hello, this is Dennis Polis. I'm the one who does the Open Philosophy series. Today I'm making a video response to a video called The Irrationality of Theism, posted by some person with an unknown name, but who goes by HonestDiscussioner. I really enjoy having people respond to my work. Discussioner's video has already boosted my viewership, and I appreciate that and thank him for it. I also appreciate thinking about the objections that people make. They help me sharpen my ideas and improve my communication skills. I don't mind discussing ideas. However, HonestDiscussioner seems not to be interested in discussing ideas, but in, quote, destroying me intellectually. I don't know why I had such an intense urge to intellectually destroy this man. Perhaps it was his calling naturalism a faith, or the way he tried to make the majority of science seem to be on his side when few would actually agree with him in real life. Of course, naturalism is a faith. It's based on an a priori commitment to the non-existence of things other than the material and physical world. Any ideas that we might have that the world is limited to the merely material have to be established on the basis of empirical data. Yet naturalism does not do that. Naturalism begins with assuming that there is nothing beyond the natural world, and that's certainly a faith statement. As to the majority of science being on my side, there's a difference between science and scientists. Everything I say is compatible with all of the science I know. Of course, the majority of scientists don't necessarily agree with me, but they are not science. When they disagree, they're disagreeing on philosophical interpretations. After some preliminary noises about being unable to purchase my book, which my website makes perfectly clear is still in preparation and unpublished, HonestDiscussioner begins his criticism by attacking my thesis that natural science neglects data on human subjectivity. In doing natural science, we don't care about the knowing subjects, we care about the objects in nature. As a result, we fix on them and abstract away both the experiential interactions and the knowing subjects. As a result, we have objective, observer-independent data on the objects of our interest, namely the objects in nature. However, when we turn to the mind, which is the core of human subjectivity, we have no data.
Now, a very quick search shows this is entirely untrue. The study I found very easily was Camentini and Tong, Decoding the Visual and Subjective Contents of the Human Brain. This was back in 2005.
Well, here's the article in question. And yes, HonestDiscussioner is right. Here's the word subjectivity right in the title, and here it is again in the abstract. Science must be dealing with subjective data in a way in which I had never anticipated before in my entire life. But wait, maybe we should actually read the article and see what it is that these scientists did. Well, what they did was present gratings in various orientations, namely vertically, horizontally, and at 45-degree increments in between. Present gratings to 4 subjects, and then they took fMRIs, functional magnetic resonance images, of what was going on in their occipital cortex, which is at the back of the brain. It's where the visual center, V1, is located. And they found that the orientation was reflected by the preferential excitement of certain regions within the occipital cortex, and that by looking at what regions were excited, they could tell what orientation the gratings were. Good. Nothing wrong with that. A good solid study of visual processing in the brain. However, what's lacking is any kind of subjective input. The authors did not themselves say how subjectivity informed their own perception of what was going on, nor, if you read the methods section, did they ask their subjects for their subjective reactions, their awareness of what was happening. In fact, the entire study was done objectively. If this is all that HonestDiscussioner requires, his idea of subjectivity is very different from my own. My idea of subjectivity is what occurs in the first-person projection, what we as subjects see within ourselves, not what outside observers see looking in. This study has no first-person data whatsoever.
You also have Dr. Damian Cruz of Cambridge University, who says, quote, recent developments in neuroimaging techniques can provide a measure of levels of awareness. We are now able to measure subjective awareness simply by looking at the human brain.
Yes, HonestDiscussioner is right. Cruz, Monti, and Owens did publish a paper in which they discussed measuring the levels of awareness. Oh, they discussed measuring the levels of awareness. They didn't discuss measuring awareness itself. Clinicians faced with brain-damaged patients often have to tell whether they still are aware. Normally, a doctor would ask a patient to do something to signal that he is aware. For example, a patient might be asked to blink. If the patient can blink, then we know he is aware. But suppose that the brain is damaged in such a way that what controls our muscular movements is non-functional. That does not mean that the patient is unaware. He could still be aware, but trapped in his own head. What Cruz, Monti, and Owen are pointing out is that functional magnetic resonance imaging allows us to detect awareness, not directly, but in terms of its effect. Just as awareness can be detected by asking a patient to blink or close their eyes, so awareness can be detected by asking them to control various brain functions. For example, you could ask a patient to visualize an image. If the patient then excites the visual cortex, you know that he's responding to that command. So what is going on here is no different in principle than asking a person to wave their hand or blink their eyes. It's just that the motions, the changes which are occurring, are internal to the brain. In fact, this study confirms my model because it shows that awareness is able to control the brain just as I have posited.
So, Dr. Polis, are you prepared to admit that science does in fact deal with subjective information?
I have never said that neuroscience does not deal with information which is available both subjectively and objectively. What I said was that in the subject-object relationship, which we call knowing, science fixes upon the known object rather than the knowing subject per se. When an observer reports, he reports on what he observes, not on himself observing. Of course, science used to report on the observer observing. Introspection used to be a part of science. Next we come to a minor character attack. Read the caption here. It implies that I use others' work in violation of the U.S. copyright laws. HonestDiscussioner seems to be unaware of the fair use doctrine, which allows brief excerpts to be used in reviews, criticism, and for educational purposes. You will find acknowledgments of my sources at the end of my videos. While cognitive science has a good and improving model of brain function and neural data processing, it has no model whatsoever for our awareness of the data the brain does process. Instead of a model, we have the promise of a model. This is a promise that goes back to Thomas Hobbes in the 1600s and has yet to be fulfilled.
Christians have been promising the imminent return of Jesus Christ for about 2,000 years now. That's over 5 times as long.
This is a particularly surprising but apt comparison. Both are faith statements.
Going even further, though, Hobbes may have promised a naturalistic model centuries ago, but we simply didn't have the tools back then. We still don't really have the tools yet.
And that's why it's called a faith statement.
We probably shouldn't have expected to solve the most difficult problem of neuroscience in that amount of time. I mean, it isn't like we haven't made any progress since then.
Yet, as David Chalmers has pointed out, not only is there no model, there is no progress toward a model.
This seems strange to me, and I couldn't find this anywhere in Chalmers' work.
Perhaps HonestDiscussioner should have started by reading Chalmers' most famous work, The Conscious Mind. If he had started with the introduction, this is the text he would have found. Consciousness, however, is as perplexing as it ever was. It still seems utterly mysterious that the causation of behavior should be accompanied by a subjective inner life. Skipping ahead, present-day scientific theories hardly touch the really difficult questions about consciousness. We do not just lack a detailed theory. We are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order. I read someone saying that we are entirely in the dark. I think it's reasonable to paraphrase that by saying that we've made no progress. Having been unable to read down to the bottom of the first page of Chalmers' book, HonestDiscussioner thought that he ought to email Chalmers himself and see what he had to say.
Hi, I don't think I've made the zero progress claim. I think we've made minor progress around the edges, both in the science and the philosophy, in getting clearer on various issues, in understanding various strategies for reductionists and non-reductionists alike.
We have to interpret these remarks in the context of what Chalmers actually wrote. If being in the dark is not zero progress, so be it. Imagine that you had contracted to have a building constructed, and you go and talk to the architect and ask what progress has been made. Of course, there's no building, but the architect tells you that he's toured Europe and Asia seeking out new strategies for building. Is this progress toward building? Well, in some vague sense it is. Is the building actually under construction? Are there plans for how to construct it? No, there aren't. So if we interpret progress as progress on the core issue, there is no progress. And Chalmers' email confirms that. So isn't it better to have a provisional model which accounts for all of the data than a model that accounts for half the data?
You see, Dr. Polis makes the mistake of accusing an incomplete model of inherently being inferior to his complete model. What matters is whether there is actually any evidence to support either.
The rest of this video on the Two-Subsystem Mind goes on to present evidence-based arguments. HonestDiscussioner seems either unwilling or unable to deal with these arguments because he skipped them and went on to my next video, which is also evidence-based, even if he doesn't agree with the evidence. Let's look at that. I haven't got time in this video to deal with all of the nonsense which HonestDiscussioner brings up. The main problem, however, is that HonestDiscussioner is unwilling to accept scientific studies. I backed up my claim that our intentions can control our behavior by looking at the results of over 1,000 studies published in psychology and physics journals. Let's look at a few. In a 1989 paper, Dean Radin and Roger Nelson analyzed data from 832 experiments, showing that we have intentional control over random numbers. The odds against this happening randomly were 1 in 24,000. In 1991, Dean Radin and Diane C. Ferrari published a paper analyzing 152 studies by 52 principal investigators and found an 18 standard deviation effect. In 2003, Radin and Nelson published a reanalysis of their original studies plus additional studies that have been done since and found a 16 standard deviation effect. In 2007, Robert John and his colleagues published the results of a 12-year study. It showed a 7 standard deviation effect. The odds of this happening randomly are about 1 in 35 trillion. HonestDiscussioner justifies his rejection of this mass of data by criticizing the process of meta-analysis. Of course, not all of the studies are meta-analyses.
Of course, the studies he does cite are really questionable at best. The use of meta-analysis to prove a point is actually a bit shady. Usually they're only used to direct further research.
This, of course, is utter and complete nonsense. Virtually every physical constant has had its value determined by meta-analysis. Meta-analysis, of course, is a standard technique used throughout the natural sciences. For example, in Bornstein's book, we read on page 312, meta-analysis methods have a long history in the field of physics. For example, Raymond Burge published a paper on methods for combining estimates of physical constants from different experiments in 1932. In 1941, he summarized numerous attempts that had been made to measure the speed of light in a vacuum and calculated the weighted averages of these findings. A similar approach has been used for other important constants. These are essentially meta-analyses of multiple experiments, although the term meta-analysis was not introduced until 1976.
And many scientists that have looked at the data see a lot of selective selections, shall we say?
This is not only nonsense, but a problem which I discussed in the video which he supposedly watched. All of the meta-analyses in question had extensive tests for the so-called file drawer effect, the effect by which insignificant studies are filed away while significant ones are published. Each meta-analysis showed a significant result even after the file drawer effect was taken into account.
There's only one other thing I really feel that needs addressing, and that's his video number 15.
I only have two things to say about his comments on my video 15. The first is that apparently he has no sense of humor and can't recognize parody when he sees it. And the second is that having missed the parody entirely, when I come to the serious argument, he doesn't address that either. So, he missed the point on both counts.